Welcome, good afternoon, good evening on the East Coast, good morning in Tokyo. Welcome to the Japan Zoominar at UC San Diego. I'm Ulrike Schede. I'm the director of JFIT, the Japan Forum for Innovation and Technology, and I'm the host of this Zoominar. JFIT is at GPS, the School of Global Policy and Strategy at the University of California in San Diego. We are an international relations and public policy school, and we have a master's in international affairs with a Japan specialization. If you're interested in our programmatic offerings or what we do at JFIT, our Japan Forum, please check us out at gps.ucsd.edu or at jfit.ucsd.edu. We also have a bi-weekly newsletter, and it's free if you'd like to subscribe and get our view of the world, the San Diego Japan Newsflash. Go to our website and go under News and Media, and there's a sign-up sheet. And on that same website, by the way, you can also find the Japan Zoominars, including past recordings. So we're in the process of building a library of these events, and you can listen to these Zoominars at your own calendar if you prefer. The Zoominar is a weekly event, so we meet every Tuesday at 4:30. And after today, we'll take a break. I'll send you into the new year with our jumping cow moment, after the end of today's show. But while I have your attention, let me just alert you that we're going to relaunch on January 12th with Jesper Koll, who's going to talk about what to expect in Japan in 21-22 and the power of Suganomics. And then we'll do a take two of today's event. Actually, we'll have Professor Aaron Chung from Johns Hopkins talk about immigration in East Asia and how grassroots efforts lead to integration. So mark your calendars. We'll be back beginning January 12th. All right, and today, of course, we're going to talk about immigration policies and the societal impact of immigration in Japan. And so let me actually, before I stop and introduce the two speakers, let me introduce their two books. As you know, at the Japan Zoominar, we often bring in authors that have new books out so that we can hear about these books and decide whether we want to buy and read them. And on the right is Help Not Wanted, Immigration Politics in Japan by Michael Strausz, a 2019 book. And we'll hear about it momentarily. And on the left, you see Gracia Liu-Farrer's book, Immigrant Japan, Mobility and Belonging in an Ethno-nationalist Society. And without further ado, here they are. Welcome, dear guests. It's great to have you here. Welcome, Gracia. Welcome, Michael. It's wonderful to have you and taking time out of your busy schedules to be with us here today. So let me introduce you both, and then we'll launch our discussion. So Professor Gracia Liu-Farrer is a professor of sociology at Waseda University. She is at the Graduate School of Asia Pacific Studies, basically our colleague school, I guess. She's also the director of the Institute of Asian Migrations at Waseda. Her degrees are in English from Fudan University, in education from the University of Chicago, and then the PhD is the Department of Sociology from the University of Chicago. And you've taught at Tohoku, Ochanomizu, and universities and Waseda since 2014. Professor Liu-Farrer has two books. Her first book was Labor Migration from China to Japan, which is a 2011 book, I believe, and maybe also a topic that we'll talk about today. This migration from China to Japan is a new and growing phenomenon, which is very interesting. And her recent book, of course, I just introduced you. We'll hear all about it. Professor Michael Strausz is Associate Professor of Political Science and the Director of Asian Studies at Texas Christian University. His research focuses on Japanese politics with an emphasis on immigration policy, but that's not exclusively. You've also worked on whaling and some other very interesting topics. Professor Strauss's BA is from Michigan State, and his PhD, MA and PhD are from the University of Washington. As I already mentioned, he's the author of Help Not Wanted. He also has several articles, many book chapters with interesting titles, such as "This is not an immigration policy," or "Does the LDP want to build a wall to Question mark. So, Michael, you're also the organizer of the Japan Political Science Group at APSIA, which is the Association of Political Science in America. And thank you for your good work to herd us together when we are at APSIA. So it's great to see you, and thank you for joining me. So we've decided what we want to do is we're going to have Michael go first because he's going to talk about the politics and policies, and then we'll have Gracia follow second. So Michael, the floor is all yours. I think you're going to show us some pictures. Go for it.
Yes. All right. All right. Well, thank you so much, Ulrike, for hosting us. It's great to be here, to have a chance to talk about my research with some people from all over the world. Today, in this very short talk, I'm going to do three things. I'm going to outline the overall question of my book, and then I'm going to give a quick overview of my answer, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about some developments that have happened in Japan. They were actually happening as my book was coming out, so as I was finishing up the final revisions, but I think these are really important and are really important in understanding what's going on with immigration in Japan today. But in terms of the overall puzzle or question of my book, you can tell what it is, or you might get a sense of what it is looking at this graph, right? So compared with other advanced industrialized countries, Japan has very few foreign residents. So this data is a little bit old. It's gone up a little bit, but nevertheless, still quite a small percentage of people living in Japan are foreign residents. And this is particularly puzzling because Japan has intense labor shortages, and Japan has a longer term demographic problem of a rapidly declining and aging population. So there's the question of who will care for the Japanese people as they get older, given the what's sometimes called the upside down demographic pyramid. So that's the overall question. Especially given these demographic realities, why does Japan have so few foreign residents? And in order to answer this question, I developed what we political scientists, we like our 2x2 table. So I developed a 2x2 table categorizing the different kinds of immigration control regimes in the world. And I'll talk about each axis here, but I'm going to start by talking about the y-axis. So I envision as countries are making, especially advanced industrialized countries, are making immigration control policy, deciding who to let in, there's often a fight or a dispute between the state, which often wants to restrict immigration, and labor-intensive businesses, which want laborers. And in Japan, for the most part, and we'll talk about some exceptions, but labor-intensive businesses did not get what they wanted. They lost their battle against the Japanese state. Why was that? So I argue that this actually has something to do with agriculture. So I'm going to put up another graph here. So this compares Japan with some of its peer countries, France, Germany, and the UK, looking at the percent of each of those countries that were employed in the agricultural sector. And this is important because as countries are industrializing, manufacturing firms need laborers. And the agricultural sector is a good place from which to recruit laborers. Now, looking carefully at this graph, we can see that in 1961, what the country, which at the time was known as West Germany, that is the year that West Germany first started to adopt guest worker agreements with countries including Turkey. At that time, about 13% of West Germans were working on farms. Japan didn't reach that 13% level until 1973. So Japanese firms had a lot longer of a period where they could recruit agricultural laborers. And if we look what was happening in the late 60s and early 70s, Japanese firms were going to the state and they were starting to work out on a relatively small scale some ways of bringing in foreign laborers. So it was starting to happen. But then in 1973, you had a global economic crisis after the Yom Kippur War, the oil shocks, a major suppression of demand, and Japanese firms were no longer faced with labor shortages because of that, and thus the pressure stopped. And really the pressure didn't pick up again. The labor shortages didn't become severe again until the mid-1980s. And by that time, Japan's governing elites had had between 2 and 3 decades to observe the experience of European countries with foreign labor. And I argue this wasn't inevitable, but Japan's governing elites, especially in the Ministry of Justice, came to the conclusion that that basically foreign labor failed in Europe. And because of that, they decided, again, especially in the Ministry of Justice, that Japan was not going to admit foreign laborers on a large scale like European countries had done, because they didn't like what they saw in Europe. Okay, so that's one piece of my argument. The second piece, I'm just going to highlight this and mention it, and we can talk more about this in the Q&A. But I argue that there, in post-war Japan, this is a really important distinction, because during World War II and in Imperial Japan was different, but in post-war Japan, there hasn't been an influential strain of elite thought, which suggests that a large group of foreigners have a legitimate role as citizens, basically as long-term residents of Japan. And I'm just going to bracket that point now. We can come back to it in question and answer. Okay. I was just finishing up the final revisions on my book in December of 2018. Japan made a major revision to the Immigration Control and Refugee Recognition Act. That revision did a number of things. One of those things was that it set up 14 new visa categories for foreign laborers. These visa categories, I think, are different from any other visa categories that Japan has had in the post-war period, because they permit foreign laborers basically without college degrees. So that's what I mean by low skilled, basically, to come to Japan as laborers rather than as trainees or as co-ethnics or spouses. They could just come to Japan. Yep, I'm a construction worker. I'm going to get this visa and come do construction work in Japan. It was the first time that it happened in the post-war period. And although the numerical target wasn't in the law, a few weeks after the law came out, the Abe cabinet set this target of almost 350,000 people over a 5-year period using these new visa categories. So that would make this visa, if they ever got that many people, that would make this one of the biggest visa categories in Japan. Not the biggest, but I think in the top 5 of the visa categories in Japan. And just so you can see how this law has been going so far, the government just released the September data. So I've just been kind of been keeping track. According to the September data, there's currently about almost 9,000 people using these visa categories. So Japan is on track to have about 8,000 people. To have about 40,000 people, assuming these rates continue. Now, of course, these rates could rapidly accelerate. There's no reason to assume that these rates are continued. My suspicion is the rates have perhaps slowed a little bit because of COVID. I suspect COVID has slowed everything down. So I imagine these lines would be curving upward more rapidly if it weren't for COVID. But this is sort of what has happened so far with those visa categories. Keep in mind that 350,000 target set by the Abe administration was over 5 years. So they haven't failed to reach that target yet. And then the third thing that law did was create a new government office to help foreigners adjust to Japan. Okay, so why did this law pass when it did? Well, I'll give you a reason, and then I'll talk about why I still don't think we can say that Japan has an elite school, a dominant elite school of thought would suggest that foreigners belong. So basically, the reason that this happened is because Japan's labor shortages in the mid to late teens were more intense than they had ever been. And so I'm going to show you some data now of job seekers ratio. This is just basically a measure of labor scarcity. So higher numbers means businesses are having a harder time finding laborers. And you can see over time, so this graph goes back to, I think, the early 60s. 63. You can see over time, this graph has 3 peaks. So there have been 3 times when labor shortages were really intense in Japan. The first peak was right around that period where I was talking about earlier, right around 1973. Right before the global oil crisis. The second peak was in 1989, 1990, right when Japan passed its major revision to the Immigration Control and Refugee Recognition Act, which established the trainee visa, which is still in use. And the third peak is actually the overall peak of the graph was 2016, and it's kept going up, right? So labor shortages just got really, really intense. So the Abe administration had to do something about it. They were facing their constituencies needed laborers. But Abe was very clear, and this is, I'm glad that Ulrike mentioned the title of my article that's coming out, my chapter that's coming out next week. I think it'll come out in January in a book about migration governance in Asia called "This is not an immigration policy," because that's what Abe kept saying throughout the year. He kept repeating it over and over, and it was like the exact same phrase he would use. He would always say, "Imin seisaku dewanai," like it's not an immigration policy. It's not an immigration policy. And the reason he said that, he would give the same reasons also. One was because these laborers using these 14 new visa categories would not be permitted to bring their families, right? They're really laborers. They come to Japan by themselves, they work, and then they leave, right? So there's a fixed amount of time that they're able to be in Japan. And so for these two reasons, Abe kept repeating, this is not an immigration policy. It's more like a foreign labor policy or even a temporary foreign labor policy. So in other words, these people using these new visa categories won't be treated as long-term potential citizens, but rather as short-term laborers who will come to Japan, work, and then leave. Okay, and given the scale of Japan's issues in terms of both the declining and aging population as well as the short-term labor shortages, I think we're likely to see more change. I don't know what it's going to be. I haven't heard the Suga administration saying anything in particular that they're planning to do, but I think it's likely that we'll see more expansion of foreign labor. But I think the question that I'm going to end with a question rather than a solid conclusion because I don't know. The question that I think I'm left with is, with these changes, I think Japan will likely at some point move to the yes line here. They will become, eventually the businesses will get the laborers they need. But I think the question is, will Japan become a country like Switzerland, or perhaps more darkly like the Gulf states, as Erin Chung, who I think is in the audience, has suggested in some of her work? Or will Japan find a way to treat these foreigners as sort of potential citizens and sort of try to integrate them, large numbers of foreigners, into Japanese society, and then Japan could come more like a country of immigration? So I'm going to close with that, and then I'm going to take my slides away so Gracia can share hers.
Well, thank you, Michael. Terrific tour de force. So your main argument, fantastic, and it gives us a lot of ground to discuss. So, Gracia, you want to go next? You're muted, so and I can't help you with that, actually. Yep. Can you unmute yourself? No, you're still muted.
All
there
right.
you go. Okay, great.
Yes, I think Michael has laid out a very nice ground. So I think I'll just follow up on where he has left. So I think my research has been about immigrants in Japan. And so the first point I want to emphasize, which is actually the objective of the book that I've just published, is that Japan is an immigrant country already, even though it's a kind of ethno-nationalist one. So as Michael has mentioned, although Japan resisted an immigration policy, whatever Prime Minister Abe said publicly about how Japan is not going to be an immigration country, and as this labor policy is not an immigration policy, most migrants entering the border on a mid to long-term visa have a legal path to settlement, including those SSW workers. In fact, if after 5 years, if they qualify, so-called qualify to, in terms of their skills and the occupational skills, they can get SSW2, and then they will be eligible for permanent residency. And in fact, the current, what Michael has shown, a large chunk of the people who are in that number are actually former technical interns. That's the majority of the people who are currently SSW workers. So I think this actually qualifies. You have this legal path to permanent residency. So, and for some highly skilled people, they're offered a priority passage to permanent residency. So I think legally, actually, it makes it an immigrant country. And also, I want to emphasize that millions of immigrants are living in Japan, even though it's a relatively small population. There are significant presence in the country, and acknowledging that Japan is an immigrant country, I believe, is a first step to acknowledge these immigrants. And you have, otherwise, what are they? And so only by recognizing these are immigrants and this is the immigrant country, we can actually advocate for institutional changes. So I think that's very important for us to advocate this. And also, I just want to use Japan as a case to debunk the kind of myth somehow immigrant countries have to be settler countries like US or Canada. I mean, in an age of globalization, I mean, we witness patterns of migration having fundamentally changed, and experiences of migrants in those traditional settler countries do not really represent the majority of the migrants in the world. In fact, I think with a strong cultural and ethnic national identity, Japan represents the type of immigration destination that's emerging in many parts of the world. So, so I think Japan is not a unique immigrant country in that regard. And in fact, a lot of countries are ethno-nationalist immigrant countries, and to a certain extent, the US even, and the UK are shifting toward that direction as well. So I think Japan is not a unique case. And however, I do think Japan's ethno-nationalist identity is problematic for creating, institutional frameworks that are appropriate for integrating immigrants. So far, Japan always has like coexisting. Does not mean, they're like an integral part of society. So what I want to emphasize, the second point, is that migration into Japan is a pragmatic process. Oh, I'm sorry. And so is the process of settlement. So why, there are so many immigrants. And I actually devoted several chapters in my book to describe what motivates immigrants to come to Japan and how they fit in Japan's economy, and why some want to stay, others want to leave. I just want to emphasize Japan does offer a lot of economic opportunities, right? It's a developed country, and as Michael has already shown, has the very serious labor shortages. And so, and immigrants come for that and they'll stay for that as well. And also Japan is culturally attractive. It's a traditional and pop culture actually have been attracting a lot of people who actually are drawn to it. And also, people go to a place or stay in a place for all kinds of affective reasons. They have their loved ones, intimate relationships, or they want to escape, some of the home country constraints. And also they make lifestyle choices. And Japan, in many regards, actually fit that kind of criteria. And many immigrants stay in Japan because their life has been transplanted into Japan. Despite our discussion on transnationalism but when people move into a new destination, they immediately try to spin a web of life. And actually, over the time, the longer one stays in this new place, the more tenuous their ties with the old place has become. And so a lot of migrants actually have lost touch with the labor market, for example, in their sending country. They cannot go back. They don't know how they can find job when they go back. And also they have family here, they have friends here. And so, the longer they stay, the less likely that they can leave. And I just want to say, even though Japan is ethno-nationalist, Japan is considered exclusionary, but Japan is a good society. I keep telling people, and as a global city, it's actually affordable. A lot of housing is affordable in Japan. And immigrants might feel marginalized and occasionally alienated. They also acknowledge that the social system actually functions well in Japan. And they also respect and try to follow the normative practices in Japan. That's what I have observed among the immigrants in Japan. You know, they don't try to, okay, assert my autonomy. I don't need to do this. But once they come to Japan, they respect the norms, and they try to do that, and they get used to behaving that way. So that makes them actually continue to stay in Japan. So I think, and I'm not saying that this is some intended process. It's rather a pragmatic process, as all migration process is. But the lack of the sort of institutional frameworks for immigration and integration do, you know, make immigrants and also the local governments and the companies bear the burden to integrate them. And also the sort of ethno-nationalist narratives of the country make immigrants belonging very difficult. In most institutions in Japan, I think for those of you who have been to Japan or lived in Japan, I think are largely domestically oriented. They include foreigners, but they do not do extra things to accommodate foreigners. For example, the employment system, they want foreigners, they will actually hire foreigners, but they will not change their career organization and requirements and cultural expectations for foreigners. So a lot of actually foreign workers find it very difficult to, first of all, to overcome the cultural barriers to enter the employment system. Secondly, to develop their careers according to their own wish in Japanese firms. So that actually, you know, makes a Japanese firm sometimes less attractive, even though it really trains people and it's willing to incorporate people and hire people, even though they don't have particular skills. And also, I kept saying that the educational institution in Japan is the most problematic. Not only the children of immigrants oftentimes find oppressive, there are also, you know, there are incidents that show that foreign children sometimes are tracked into special education programs and programs designated for those people. And in fact, the concerns about children's education made many skilled professionals hesitate to stay in Japan. And also the education system failed to educate, especially I think among the Nikkei Brazilian immigrants. There's downward intergenerational education mobility. So the last thing I just want to, it's a kind of question. Can Japan not to be ethno-nationalist? And I think Michael in his wonderful book actually mentioned there are moments, right, in Japanese history around 2008, and there's the LDP politicians were considering expanding population of immigration and changing, re-envision Japan as possibly as a more assimilative country, you know, and in fact, the Ministry of Justice in 2000, also around 2008, and proposed this sort of control, you know, basic plan, asking, you know, people to debate about the future image and future shape of Japan. But that was very short-lived. very soon, actually, the fifth plan of MOJ just went back to coexistence, went back to all the human resources and utilitarian kind of image. So that actually is very short-lived. But that actually gives me hope. I'm just thinking, this is something I'm also pondering on. Is Japan possible? Is it, as Michael mentioned, is an alternative Japan possible, another Japan possible? The thing is, Japan, I think, has more than ethno-nationalism in its cultural toolbox. Japan is very religiously plural, and actually it has a hybrid cultural forms. Japan has demonstrated its ability to reinvent culture, to incorporate different cultures. And I think, you know, in the future of Japan probably needs to dig into that particular cultural toolbox to think what actually the future Japan is going to be like, and that actually this rethinking about its own kind of identity is necessary for Japan to become a truly inclusive immigrant country. So I think I'll stop here. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you very much. So you have given us ample food for thought, and already the Q&A is coming in, and audience, feel free to type up your questions and I will see how I can weave them into the discussion. So let me take maybe take on this last aspect of the pragmatic process of immigration and this toolbox. So as you know, the framework that I use in my book to explain what's happening in Japan and how Japan is trying to make its trade-offs is tight-loose theory, or the framework of tight-loose, which argues that countries differ persistently and over time in the consensus, the depth of the consensus of what the right behavior is, and the intensity with which this consensus is implemented. That is to say, how people react to deviance. So the example I like to use is, when here in California, if my colleague shows up to work with hair dyed green, everybody shrugs and says, "Oh, that's cute." And if nobody in Japan would ever go to work with a hair dyed green, because you don't do that. Or if somebody did, people would get concerned. Is something not quite right? And why is their hair green? And what happened? And so Japan is this is a very careful research that went into this. And so they went around the world and in 33 countries, 7,000 survey respondents, very carefully done. And they found sort of a hierarchy of countries from tight to loose. And so loose is, the Anglo-Saxons, in New Zealand in particular, but also Israel, and the Ukraine. And then on the tight side, we have places like Japan and Korea and Norway, interestingly, and a number of other places. So the reason I bring this up is that I have found that tight loose actually correlates with a lot of these outcomes that we find. And so the story for Japan and or Norway from a tight loose framework would go something like this. We want foreigners that fit in. So we set up a very strict system of integration. You have to learn the language. You have to learn how to separate the garbage. You have to learn not to be urusai. You can't be noisy, can't rock the boat. You have to learn this, you have to learn that. And once you have that, once you have bought into this structure, then basically you're okay. You're okay, right? So and that is a choice, right? It's a policy choice. It's a social choice. It's a choice that societies make. But it works, and Gracia, you brought this up, right? So the social system in Japan actually works well. Once you've arrived and once you've bought in to the right behavior, then you're okay. And so what that system actually sets up is self-selection, and it repels people that don't buy into the culture, and it attracts people that either have no problem or in fact respect and admire the structures that Japan offers. And a Norwegian would tell you the same thing. They would have to learn in Norway, you have to, just the same, you have to learn the language, you have to learn how to survive. And and I could go on of where that comes from, but it's a very interesting framework. And so just in short, Michelle Gelfand, who's a creator of this theory, has observed, and with her colleagues, that countries that have a lot of exogenous shocks or potential exogenous shocks to their societies, whether that's an earthquake or a snowstorm or things like that, tend to be tighter, because they want society to be on sort of an automatic behavior. When a calamity happens, people know what to do, where to go, how to be safe. And so earthquake drills, of course, every immigrant to Japan, the first thing we have to do is we have to go through a bunch of earthquake drills, right? And once everybody knows that we're going to be safe, we're going to know what we're going to do, we're okay. They can now, okay, now you're good. You've arrived, you know what to do in an earthquake. And that's actually a very caring and very important part of Japanese society. Right? So you could actually reframe that. So it's pragmatic. It's completely pragmatic. It has it's all driven by we need to make sure that the society works even if there's a bad event. So then now the question is, how do you square that with immigration policy? And Michael, I want to pick up on that a little bit. So you know, this, the prime minister is saying this is not an immigration policy. Does this, is that just a sort of a tatemae, sort of a screen, so that if it's not an immigration policy, then people don't have to be against it?
Yeah, I think he was trying to appeal to his supporters. And I think one of the things, I don't know if I should bring up this slide. Maybe I'll just describe it to you, because last year I did a survey experiment with one of my students who was supposed to be here, but it looks like she didn't sign up, and a Todai student, where we presented Japanese voters with political candidates, and we randomly varied the candidate's stance on immigration. And then we asked people how likely they would be to vote for the candidate. The candidate was from their party. And we gave the candidate some random biographical, it made the candidate seem very typical. But one of our questions that we measured, we measured ethnocentricity. So we had a question that was, some people say that foreigners enrich Japan. Others say that foreigners undermine Japan. Where do you put yourself? Not surprisingly, from what I've seen from other public opinion data, the majority of our respondents thought that foreigners enrich Japan. So they were on the less ethnocentric side. But the ethnocentric people were, first of all, predominantly conservative. So I think that's why Abe is trying to not scare those people away by denying it's an immigration policy. But second of all, they would vote on that issue. So if they heard that a candidate was pro-immigration, they would not vote for that candidate. Whereas the people that thought that foreigners enrich Japan, it wouldn't affect the way that they voted. They wouldn't be less likely to vote for the person, but they also wouldn't be more likely to vote for the person. So then a candidate with no stance on immigration at all. So I think that a part of what's going on is that the anti-immigrant forces in Japan are small but loud. And they care a lot about it, and they're organized, and they can be mean. So I think that this is a part of what's going on. So people like LDP politicians like Abe and Suga, those people are their constituents. So they have to worry about those people. They don't want to drive those people off. So I think that's a part of what's going on with Abe refusing to admit that he's advocating an immigration policy when I think he clearly is.
So we have a question on what the reality actually is for people on the ground. And this is probably something that we're going to pick up again in January when we do part 2 of this. But what do, so first of all, what do Japanese people think? So Michael, if you could go a little bit more into this. And then the other side of the question is, are there any metrics on measuring the quality of life of immigrants to Japan, right? So are they, I mean, Gracia, you may have talked a little bit about the ijime at the schools, right? So ijime is bullying. Are immigrants bullied or just slow track because they don't speak the language, or are there other things? Are they? We kind of know because of the visa that they work in certain sectors of the economy that are maybe sankei, right? So 3D, dirty, dangerous, demanding, or you know, what is the, is there a sense of, you know, the quality of life that immigrants to Japan now enjoy, and has it changed over time? So maybe Michael first on the first one, and then Gracia on the second.
So the first question was what the Japanese public actually thinks.
Yeah, so if you go to Japan, you talk to people, right, on the street. I mean, Gracia may know this as well, of course, since you are in Tokyo. So has the mindset shifted? Are people becoming more open to this gaijin in the, you know, helping you in the convenience store? I think so, but yeah, are people nervous that they're going to lose jobs for these immigrants? Are people nervous that they lose their national identity because it's now watered down? So what's the scuttlebutt from the ground?
Well, Gracia lives in Japan, so she should definitely talk about this question too. But since you told me to go first, I'll just say, I mean, looking at public opinion data, it looks like in the last few years, public opinion has shifted more in favor of increased immigration. And in my own personal experience, again, I don't live in Japan or teach at a Japanese university. I feel really welcome. I haven't seen anything like in terms of, I feel welcome when I'm in Japan, especially because I do speak Japanese and I feel like I kind of know where to put my trash and things like that, you know, but I think one of the really interesting things that I've noticed going on is that when I talk to Japanese politicians and bureaucrats, they're much more critical of the Japanese public in terms of being xenophobic than I think the Japanese public always is. And that's not new. Since I've been working on this topic, doing elite interviews, back on immigration, 2008, 2009, people would always tell me, oh, the Japanese people are too xenophobic. They can't handle foreigners. But then when I actually talked to Japanese people or looked at public opinion data, that wasn't what I saw. But it seemed like it was more, they didn't, the elites themselves were perhaps a little bit apprehensive. But in terms of what's happening on the ground, I think I'm sort of, I agree with the way that Gracia presented it, which in a lot of ways it can be really nice for immigrants in Japan. I mean, depending on their jobs and things like that. But Gracia, go ahead.
Okay, I think you have really put it very nicely. I think on the ground, in fact, for the Japanese people, so decades of this ethno-nationalist education, really, it has, entrenched all that sort of discourses and identity into their mind, right? So it's hard for a lot of Japanese people to think somehow Japanese culture, Japan is not unique. So I think there also, I think Burgess wrote an article about how in terms of public opinion, Japanese people do embrace that kind of identity. And in fact, I have pointed out in my book, the foreigners embrace that identity as well. So the foreigners are very surprised. Oh, you call Japan an immigrant country, but Japan is very homogeneous, and all that sort of a narrative is so dominant. So it's hard for people both in Japan and outside of Japan, immigrants and non-immigrants, to imagine Japan otherwise. So I think this is actually main hurdle. But at the same time, on the ground, in real life, I think in terms of discourse, people will say, oh, Japan is not going to be immigration country or immigrant country. But in practice, they will say, oh, this person can be Japanese, right? So actually, Kobayashi and several other scholars wrote an article in 2015. They say there is this kind of distance, and I don't know, I can't remember the term, but you can say as a category you reject, but as individuals you accept. I think that's actually what's taking place in Japan on the.
Yeah, that was the article where they showed, so like if you ask someone, do you support like Koreans, make it easier for Koreans to become citizens, they would say no. But then you say, well, do you support making it easier for Mr. Kim, this Korean, to become a citizen? And they would say yes.
Yeah, right. that actually, oops. That actually is what I found out in my field work as well, because even like the people will say, oh, Japanese people don't like them, but at the same time, they all have like some sort of Japanese friends or personal relationships. So it is very kind of I think it's people's mind just works.
We have a few questions around what it actually takes to become an immigrant in Japan, right? So is it difficult? So first of all, there's a number of questions was how difficult would it be for a Chinese student to go to Japan and study there? But then that's at one level of practicality. Does one have to speak the language? And I think the answer is yes, but I think that you will be made to learn the language. But then also, are there what does one do to have to qualify? Does one have to win the lottery or pass a test, or is it difficult to get one of these visas? And how does Japan compare? I mean, is it restrictive? Is it worse or better than Germany or other countries?
In fact, Japan is better than most OECD countries, to put it that way, for students to stay on in Japan. So first of all, I think Japan does not have a language requirement in, more or less. So students, actually a lot of students come into Japan either to English programs or to Japanese language schools, because Japanese is not a dominant foreign language for most people. So actually you do have this trajectory, legal trajectory. So you can advance if you try hard, you can advance to higher education. Upon graduation, you can find jobs. And Japan has the most organized school to work transition in the world. So everybody can apply for a job, but still the employment system requires some sort of has a cultural expectation. So it's not everybody. But the last time I checked, the retention rate of students international students, 35% in Japan. And I said OECD countries is about, it's less than a quarter on average. Canada is higher. But Germany and other countries are actually lower. So in fact, it is so much easier for a foreigner to stay. And also there isn't this sort of somehow after HB2, you cannot apply for green card, so you have to have some selection. If you qualified for the permanent residency, you can, or you can get enough points, or after you stay for 10 years, and most people who apply actually get permanent residency. So that's why I said the legal path is actually maybe smoother for people who come to Japan, for migrants who come to Japan, than to other countries.
Well, that's certainly surprising. It may be a good moment to bring Erin, who we've already mentioned, Professor Erin Chung from Johns Hopkins, who will be with us in a month. She has a question about whether there are different categories of immigrants, right? So where you have sort of a hierarchy, and at the top there's generous social welfare provisions for permanent residents that everybody wants, and maybe they're the brain workers, if you wish. And then on the other hand, there are other categories of people that are, you talked about the pragmatism of how the system might be set up. So the people that basically are permanently deportable, as she put it in quotation marks. So is there a hierarchy of non-citizens? And that there's also maybe that fits into this. Catherine wants to know whether there's actually whether this hierarchy is by geographical region. So somehow Europeans are, perceived more highly than or lower than Asians or something, or is this just education and skills, or how are these hierarchies formed? And partially that's a law question, a policy question, but also it's I think a society question.
Yeah, because I'm glad that Erin asked that, and people should come hear Erin's talk in mid-January. I think it will be terrific. She's great, and so she should probably be here with Gracia and I too. But yeah, I mean, so the way that Gracia was describing the experience of foreign students transitioning into work in Japan, I think that my understanding is that is more for people from the developed world that are basically qualifying for admission to a Japanese university. But and I think that's much less common for people from the developing world, and people from South. Well, you did, Gracia, you're making a face. I don't know. You can jump in and
most of them are Chinese, unless you consider China as developed world.
Yeah. Okay. I guess we get that's a different question. But I'm more thinking about Africa, other Southeast Asian countries, and things like that. I mean, I don't know. I haven't. I guess it depends on what kind of visa category you're qualifying for. And then if you can't get into a Japanese university, and then instead you're going to be a trainee, or you're going to be on one of these new work visas, I do think your treatment will be less good. You might feel less integrated into Japanese society, even though you might legally be eligible for some of those some of the things that Gracia was talking about in terms of permanent residency. If you stay in Japan for 10 years, I think it might be harder to be able to stay in Japan for 10 years if you qualify as a trainee rather than as a student.
Right.
I think there's a racial disparity there.
Yeah, so I think basic technical interns have no possibility to stay if they don't change their visa categories. So they are just
unless they change to the
Right, unless they get SSW, which actually the Ministry of Justice encouraging technical interns who have run away and students who have failed school to apply for SSW. That's very interesting, right? But I think the hierarchy exists because Japan's immigration policy selects on two things: skill and descent. Right. So if you're highly skilled, then you're welcome. You're given a priority passage to permanent residency as short as 1 year. and if you're descent, then obviously you're long-term residents, and you don't have any kind of constraints in terms of staying and other kind of welfare provision. So the categories that are more precarious are, for example, students. These are kind of midterm, have a possibility. The most unlikely to stay are the technical interns, because they can't, by law. But the categories that can potentially stay are the students. But I think among the students, I think it really here is the cultural affinity that actually plays a role. It's not the color, racial backgrounds or anything. It's the cultural affinity. If you are from a Kanjigen, you're from Chinese character kind of backgrounds, obviously culturally you're more advantaged. So what actually happens now, we have a lot of Vietnamese and Nepalese students in Japan. Vietnamese are the actually largest language student population, but they are not from Chinese character background. So they have much harder time to qualify for a lot of entrance examinations for the higher education. What happens, they are channeled into professional schools, like, Seimongakko, vocational training schools. They still have a pass. Actually, increasingly, they're finding jobs, but at a much lower pay and more kind of precarious situations. So Japan needs labor of all kinds. In fact, starting from last year, May, Japan, as long as you speak some Japanese and you graduate from some sort of higher postgraduate education, you work in hotel, you can get a visa. So I think that to stay in Japan actually has become easier, but still, I mean, you do see the hierarchy, but the hierarchy is really, it's kind of cultural criteria there, and to what degree you can actually overcome them.
So you just mentioned that the majority of students that we're talking about here is actually from China. Well, what do you think is that interest? And I've observed the same thing, and I think that, and I find it quite remarkable. But by an order of magnitude, in terms of foreign students, Chinese students are the #1 highest ranked. Do you have any insights of why that is? Is it just that the language is easier because you can read much faster than others, or is it that is it a pull? What is it seen as being a good thing to be in Japan?
Well, it has a history. So the Chinese student migration into Japan has been going on for over 100 years, right? So because Japan is so close, so it's considered economically viable solution. Also, the Chinese characters are used, so it's culturally more familiar. So actually, that actually is an attraction. So it's a traditional destination for Chinese students. In 1980s, when the language academies start mushrooming, start emerging, what happens is there are a lot of people recruiting Chinese students. So it's a kind of coincidence that in 1980s, China started opening up economically, and then Japan opening up the education market. So you get a lot of Chinese people who want to make some quick cash to come to Japan, but there are also students who are aspiring to higher education. So you have this kind of tradition that established, and a recent kind of a contemporary tradition established in the 1980s. And this sort of network, this infrastructure has channel a lot of Chinese students. But right now, the Vietnam is actually one of the main sending country, and that actually is largely channeled by the brokers, the education industry. Yeah.
So I could go down the that line, but we have another question that goes back to the political system, Michael. So it's our colleague Professor Hiroki Takeuchi, who also was on the Zoominar just a week ago, and 2 weeks ago actually. But so Hiroki wonders whether this sort of visa, and it's not an immigration policy, and it's not all that, whether that actually muddles the waters in the sense that it makes it very difficult in a policy sense, that it makes it very difficult to legislate appropriate laws to, for instance, protect basic human rights of foreign workers, or to have more clarity of what you can and what you cannot do, and who can come in, who cannot come in. So so is there what's the downside of this? It's a little bit sort of my approach, and you're a foreign worker, but you're not an immigrant, or you look like an immigrant, but you are technically not, or you can be sent back home. So does that cause other problems in terms of policy making and what the rules are and that sort of thing?
Yeah, I think that having, so the 1989 revision to the Immigration Control and Refugee Recognition Act basically formalized two different categories that came to be used as low-skilled labor categories, but they weren't intended for. So there was the trainee and technical internship. There's a trainee program, and then there was the long-term residency visa, which the people that passed that law did not think it would be used, but it ended up being a huge source of low-skilled foreign labor. A lot of Nikkei Brazilians with Japanese ancestry came to Japan on that visa. And so you had two visa categories, which were not officially foreign labor visas, but they were being used in that way. And then also, I should also mention, you had another visa category like that, is the entertainer visa, which was essentially became a sex workers visa. And it was, women were essentially treated, primarily women from the Philippines were brought in on the visa by brokers who were dishonest with them, and they were put in these horrible situations. But in all those cases, I think having visa categories which were set up technically for one reason, but are used in a very different way, has the potential for abuses. So both in the case of the trainee visa and the entertainer visa, I think you had pretty substantial abuses that employers were able to abuse their employees. And I think with those two visa categories, 3 different times, the United States threatened to move Japan down in its annual trafficking and persons report. And only that threat, basically combined with activism by Japanese activists on the ground, caused Japan to relent and change the way that they were treating those people. So I think that having visa categories being misused or used in ways that they weren't set up has the potential to be really dangerous, and has been really dangerous in the past. Yeah, there was one other thing. Yeah, well, I'll leave it there for now.
So, so we have a bundle of questions, and I left the most difficult for last, I guess. And there's at least 5 questions around. They're all very politely phrased, but fundamentally, what people are asking is whether there are hierarchies and whether there's racism. That is, whether society is really welcoming, or whether one person in the audience wants to know about the color of the skin, but there are others more that worry about or wonder about different rankings of Asians, right? Certain Asians are better than other Asians. Is that, my guess is it's there because, it's everywhere. How does that play out in Japan? And have there been changes over the last decade or so and sort of attitudes, or how society is sort of looking at this? Maybe, Gracia, that's a sociology question.
I'll try. Yes, I mean, of course, there is racism in Japan. I think the racism actually probably is a better phrase as xenophobia. So there's a general kind of fear, or general kind of, a little bit kind of rejection, or not is it the attitude toward foreigners. So I think that's there. In terms of racial categories, I think there are different kind of research. I mean, I I have done some myself, but I think different research has shown that, for example, Hilary Holbrough's quantitative study has shown that in cooperative Japan, in fact, if you're white, you might get away with some things that an Asian does not get away. So there is this sort of, some sort of a white privilege that you're used as a poster child, whether you like it or not. So if the person who actually enjoys that so-called privilege might not like it, right? And so I think there is this this kind of phenomenon. There is this, and also, Japan is not unaware of the racial hierarchy that out there. So there, I think John Russell has done a lot about Japan's attitude toward, let's say, Blackness. So I think that sort of things are there. But I want to just say that Japan's racism has not been violent. So actually, I have an African-American informant who asked me, and there's in one of my chapters, asked me to write down verbatim his quote. He said he could wear a hoodie at 2 o'clock and go to a convenience store, not being fearful of, his own personal security. Yes, people will look at him and be kind of surprised or shocked, but he doesn't have that sort of existential concerns. So that's actually, I think that characterizes Japan's kind of racism. In terms of Asians, yes, I think it's a more kind of class ranking. I think people are very sensitive to, where, kind of a social economic situation, and also how well you do. And I think in the daily kind of on the ground, you see this sort of a class rank more maybe saliently than, say, kind of different kind of Asian, just because right now Nepalese and Vietnamese might occupy lower social economic positions, and there are also kind of crimes being reported on, like Vietnamese technical interns. So people tend to have a bit more critical kind of or more discussion about that kind of people's problematic kind of behavior. So that's my observation.
Yeah, I want to add. Sometimes and I haven't looked at the specific wording of the questions, but I feel like, especially talking about race, like sometimes people want to approach like, is Japan uniquely racist or something? And I think there's definitely racism in Japan. And from what I've heard when I've spoke with African Americans and Africans about being in Japan, sometimes the police will take more of an interest in them than they might a white American. And things like that, and they might be more likely to stop them. I know, and then also some of the ways that like the tennis player Naomi Osaka has been discussed. I think like she wore some like Black Lives Matter things in some of the tennis tournaments, and some people on the far right were very critical of her for that. So, and even the way that Black Lives Matter, by the way, was discussed in the Japanese media was, I think, really played on stereotypes and things like that. And so I do, I don't think Japan, I mean, I think like Gracia said, I think that Japan is a part of this international system. And so the racism is definitely, my impression is racism is there too.
But it's not uniquely unique.
It's not uniquely unique. So Japan is, yeah.
Actually, the convenience store story I find very powerful, right? Because it's not clear to me that people look at an African American in a convenience store necessarily with like, ooh, but rather they're just surprised because there are so few. Right? There's partially also a curiosity of, where did this guy come from? But, well, what is this guy doing here at 2 a.m. Right? But it's not, and that's just curiosity. That's not racist. It's just observant.
And this isn't, but you hear stories too about like sometimes, if I find out I'm living in a Japanese town and I find out, oh, we're going to get a foreign teacher, and then the foreign teacher ends up being Black instead of white, I think there are people in the town that will be disappointed, or that won't believe that Black person is able to teach English or whatever, even though they're from an English speaking country. And so I think that that's a kind of racism that African Americans and Africans will face in Japan. Definitely.
In fact, I think that was more severe in 1980s and early 1990s, and I had more stories of those people's racist experiences, and then actually more recently, I think Japan also has progressed over the 3 decades.
Yeah, and I could go on for hours. Unfortunately, we're out of time, and I understand also, Gracia, you have to go and do an important meeting. So I don't want to overstretch our audience's patience. but that's a good note to end on. We have a number of questions that we try to get to later in private emails. And Japan has actually changed. Japan now does discuss immigration. The word immigration is a common word. Sociologists talk about immigrants, right? And so all of this actually is part of a change. So let me thank you both for joining me today. And I don't want the audience to disappear before I point out to them that here's my PowerPoints again, that we'll have Jesper call on January 12th. And this is our last meeting of, and then Aaron Chung, who's already been mentioned several times. This is our last meeting of this year. So I wanted to send you off with our executive manager Jafet has a good hand for this sort of thing, and he's decided to draw this year for us. The next year will be the year of the ox, and we've turned it into a jumping cow, a happy jumping cow. And I hope when we all meet again here at the Japan Zoominar, you'll all be well, you'll stay safe, have a great, happy holidays. And thank you again for today's guests, Professors Gracia Liu-Farrer and Professor Michael Strausz. Thank you both very much. And everybody stay well, take good care, and be safe. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.